Well, I'd like to welcome you here. Thank you for coming. My name is Lowell Gustafson. I'm an artist and scientist. We're really delighted to have Asaf Romirowski to join us tonight, and it's a real matter of personal pleasure for me to introduce Asaf. He's got a great preparation for discussing our topic tonight. You know, he's worked in the Israeli Defense Force, he's worked in the Jewish Federation here in Philadelphia, but most importantly, he's got his master's degree from our own Department of Political Science here at Villanova, and I like to claim full credit for all of his accomplishments because he got to take a class with me. And so I think that explains all of his success that he's enjoyed in all of these years since. But really, it's a real pleasure to invite you here and have you with us again, Asaf. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure. Thank you. Well, it really is a great pleasure to be at Villanova, especially to see old faces. Both Lowell and Joe Thompson were on my defense committee, and I do thank them gratefully for going through that and passing, and that's as my stepping stone for my career as I've dealt with these issues. Tonight, my talk remarks basically follow a lot about the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic where we are today, and how Iran fits into this larger dynamic. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. Actually, what's interesting about what I'm going to talk about tonight has to do with the fact that a lot of the research of the events that we're dealing with today started in my work here at Villanova, and that has to do with George Mitchell. When I was here and I was writing my study, I did a comparative analysis between George Mitchell and the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland versus what Mitchell attempted to do in 2001, which was then defined as the Mitchell Report, to try to create peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And that was predominantly based on the model that he established within Northern Ireland, and basically trying to take that model because of the many similarities and saying, how can this work within the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic? The conclusion of that study led me to believe that what Mitchell missed, unfortunately, in his analysis was the fact that is the importance of the theological political bond that exists between the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic versus the environment that existed in Northern Ireland. For example, the fact that Israelis and Palestinians see themselves as bonded and is tied to the land of Israel, both on a theological basis and less on the cultural basis, whereas an Irish American doesn't see Belfast in the same way Israelis and Palestinians see Jerusalem. When you look at Mitchell's report, and a lot of the investigations that I did in my work, and the interviews of people who actually wrote the report, really validated my study, because when Mitchell was going to the region, he didn't understand the importance of Jerusalem. I mean, he understood it on some level as far as the significance of what Jerusalem means to Israelis and Palestinians, but not in the political sense that had to be included in what the Mitchell report was talking about. And the idea of the Mitchell report was that basically there would be a farewell to arms, there would be a cessation of violence, and basically there would be a equal, fair share of blame. That we're both to blame for the environment, and now let's move on beyond that. When I wrote the study, I didn't believe that Mitchell would come back into the region or be part of the dynamic, and here we are in 2010, and George Mitchell is Obama's Middle East envoy. I think that what we have here is a very changed dynamic, and I think that even George Mitchell has learned from some of the mistakes that he experienced in 2001. The region itself has shifted a great deal over the course of the past 9 years, not to mention the 17 years since the Oslo Peace Accords. That was the attempt back in 1993 to establish peace between Israelis and Palestinians, and eventually come to a two-state solution by the year 2000. So basically a peace process that started in 1993. The famous White House depiction of then Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestinians, Bill Clinton, and Yitzhak Rabin came together saying we can come together and eventually come to a two-state solution in a 7-year process. That never took place, and in 2000, the second intifada, the second uprising, emerged as a result of the fact that there wasn't a two-state solution. What I think is also more significant about this larger environment when we talk about the Palestinian side of it is of course, the role that Yasser Arafat played in this larger dynamic. Yasser Arafat, for all his many flaws, and Arafat was, without doubt, a chameleon, was able to hold together Palestinian society. And what I mean by that is the fact that Arafat, for all his many flaws, Arafat walked and spoke the Palestinian cause like no other leader. He represented Palestinian society. He spoke about Palestinian society. Arafat, in his whole presentation, saw himself as the embodiment of what a Palestinian should look like. For example, Arafat always wore fatigues, the image that he was always willing to take arms. He always had a holster, again, the arms, and the fact that he had a gun to protect and defend his people. He tied his kafiyah, his head cover, and what he defined as the greater map of Palestine. And he always had on his lapel the picture of what he defined as the greater map of Palestine, which basically is the whole map of Israel, and that was Arafat's depiction of the goal of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which he founded in 1964. Arafat's ability to talk about Palestinian society was unique because he represented both segments of Palestinian society. I think that when one looks at Palestinian society, and for all my years of involvement with dealing with Palestinians, again, I was part of the negotiations in the 90s during the Oslo Peace Accords and dealing with different factions of Palestinian society, and then I was involved with the Jordanian peace process between Israelis and Palestinians. Between Israelis and Jordanians in 1994, you find that very different, significant, distinct pieces of Palestinian society. The assumption, I think, that when we talk to policymakers and we talk about, Palestinian society in the U.S. today, there is an assumption we're talking about one cohesive, united society, that it defines itself as the Palestinian national identity. The fact of the matter is, when you talk about Palestinians living in the Palestinian areas, predominantly West Bank and Gaza, you're talking about two distinct societies. West Bankers are ideologically, socially, and politically Hashemites, Jordanian mentality, and Gazans are ideologically, socially identified as Egyptian. And that's a very important distinction to be made when you're trying to analyze Palestinian society. They are so out of touch as far as, and so disconnected from their own respective societies, to a point where there is no intermarriage between West Bankers and Gazans. The Arabic that is spoken in Gaza is looked down upon by the Arabic spoken by Jordanians. I mean, this is just to give you kind of a bit of illustrations of the differentiation between West Bankers and Gazans. What binded them together all the years was the belief in the revolution, which is what Arafat was able to do. Arafat was able to go around and talk about and selling the Palestinian cause by the fact that we all are affected by the fact that our land was robbed from us and we have to maintain a revolution. And that was the cause of the PLO. So for all intents and purposes, Arafat was able to hold together both segments of Palestinian society, that is West Bank and Gaza. And historically speaking, Arafat was born in Cairo. Arafat was Gazan for our intents and purposes. Although in Arafat's mind, he saw himself as not only a theological leader, that was his lineage was drawn directly from the Prophet Muhammad, but he was also a general. And actually, an interesting tidbit is the first interview Arafat ever gave to a Western media outlet was an interview he gave to Playboy in 1987. They paid him a lot of money at the time, close to $80,000. And when Arafat gave the interview, he made a very important point. They asked him where he was born. And Arafat not only said was he born in Jerusalem, but on the steps of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Again, it was factually far from being the truth, but the fact that historically speaking, we talk about Muslim leaders. Muslim leaders defined themselves during the days of the Muslim Empire as lineage. The lineage was very key as far as they were the direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. So if if you understand Muslim history and the fact that Jerusalem, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, is the location of where Muhammad ascended to the skies from, and Yasser Arafat being the leader of the Palestinian cause in Jerusalem, and he was born not only in Jerusalem, but simply the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that gave him the credibility and the street credibility he needed to also sell himself as a Muslim leader. That was very critical to Yasser Arafat as a leader, even though that the origins of the PLO were actually Marxist when they were created in 1964. But that was Yasser Arafat, and he walked around selling the cause of the fact that we are going to continue on the revolution, and not only that, as part of that cause was also the destruction of the state of Israel, when he spoke about what this means to fuel and bolster the idea of what is the greater Palestine. This was Yasser Arafat's motto for many, many years. What happened in 1993 during the Oslo Peace Accords was basically there was an exchange of letters, and the fact that we are recognizing the fact that Jews and Palestinians have a right to exist in the same land. The other problem was, that Clinton encountered later, as you fast forward to late 90s, early 2000, was that the actual PLO covenant never actually changed the wording. The letter that it was exchanged between Rabin and Arafat was a letter, but the actual PLO covenant, which is the PLO constitution for all intents and purposes, was never altered. And that was part of the problem. And the reason Clinton went back and forth to Gaza to force Arafat to make those changes, and they were amended, some, not all. But to understand this, this is the historical background, also will give you insight to the challenges we face today. Because since Arafat died in 2004, what you have is a very clear fragmentation within Palestinian society. We have very clear, visible cleavage that exists between the West Bank and Gaza, i.e. to show you that Gaza is today controlled 100% by Hamas. There is a reason for that. And the fact that Fatah is the group that controls the West Bank, there is a reason for that as well. Arafat was able to basically hold those two together. Hamas was predominantly through financial means and monetary compensation. The fact that Arafat paid Hamas members and the Al-Aqsa Jihad members to stay together and support what he was doing, but he still was able to walk and talk the talk in both the West Bank and Gaza, and that was unique to Yasser Arafat. So Arafat's no longer part of the picture. But the question is, who are we dealing with now? And what you have is basically, you have three players. You have Hamas, which is a terrorist organization recognized by the United States and by Israel. It is an acronym for the Islamic Resistance Movement. It defines itself on and prides itself on anti-Americanism, anti-Zionism, and the destruction of the state of Israel. It ran on a platform in 2006, and then when it was elected in 2007, that was anti-American, anti-Israel, and even more important, anti the Palestinian Authority. Hamas's understanding, and knew the fact Hamas was able to become so popular because it was able to leverage all the corruption of the PLO at the time on its popularity. So they were able to tell the Palestinian people, listen, Arafat and his henchmen are not going to take care of you. We are. So, vote for us. And so they were able to point out, we have a man in every town and city from Gaza to the West Bank. But it doesn't mean that we support the Palestinian Authority, even though we are the majority party. And I guarantee you that if Palestinians go to elections today, they would still vote for Hamas. And the validation for that would be, also the fact that Fatah postponed the elections that were supposed to take place about 2 months ago because they were scared of what might happen and they will not win the majority of the Palestinian Legislative Council, and they might lose, for our intents and purposes, the whole House at large. And to have a chairman who would head the Palestinian Authority under Hamas, there was no way anything would take place. And so Hamas goes around with this ideology and basically goes around saying that everything that Fatah does on the West Bank, led by Mahmoud Abbas and by Salam Fayyad, the current prime minister of the Palestinians, is all null and void. And when they go around, and basically they will tell you, you can say whatever you want, but as far as we have the support of the people itself, you may have the money, which is what allows Fatah to continue on and look at the environment and why people still support them. But as far as a popular vote on the Palestinian street, the support for Hamas is a lot more attractive. There are younger people, and they sell themselves as a social network. They take care of social needs, educational needs, health needs, and whatnot. And because of the socioeconomic condition, and they're able to leverage that, even though their ideology is a Islamist terrorist agenda. And that's why they are so popular on the Palestinian street. The other distinction that is worth mentioning, and very important when you look at this dynamic, is the fact that Fatah and the Fatah party is a lot more secular by orientation versus the religiosity that Hamas uses to sell its agenda. So you have an Islamist agenda sponsored by Hamas that wants to bring back a very stringent set of rules that Gaza would be operated on. I mean, only of late, there was a banning of women listening to rock and roll music in the streets of Gaza or wearing makeup. I mean, this is a whole new change that you would not find in the streets of Ramallah or anywhere else in the West Bank because it exists under Gaza's control. Many of us, myself included, and many of my colleagues spoke about the fact that, if Hamas would come to power, then Gaza would transform itself into a terrorist umbrella of terrorist organizations, or a Hamastan. Sadly enough, we weren't that off by our prediction. The fact of the matter is that what you have today in Gaza City is you have a pseudo-Iranian embassy. You have Hamas, you have Palestinian Islamic Jihad, you have Hezbollah, which is very significant if you understand the dynamic within the Muslim world. The biggest cleavage within the Muslim world is the dynamic and the cleavage between Sunnis and Shiites. Hamas is a Sunni group, Hezbollah is Shia. The fact that Sunni and Shia groups are willing to come together under the umbrella of hatred towards the West and Israel is quite telling, and should be, one should look at that when one's trying to understand the dynamic of what exactly Israel is fighting and how all this is playing out in this larger dynamic of how the Middle East is shifting. So you have this terrorist cell, terrorist kind of entity in Hamas, and you have the West Bank sponsored by, or basically led by Mahmoud Abbas and Salam Fayyad with the support of the US. Because in the United States and within the Beltway, you go into Washington circles, basically there is an understanding that the only Palestinian we have that's going to actually lead to somewhere is Salam Fayyad. Salam Fayyad, for all intents and purposes, is Mr. Clean. He is the one Palestinian within Palestinian Society that you have nothing on him. He was never a member of the PLO. He was never a member of any other terrorist organization. He has a doctorate from the University of Texas in economics. He used to work at the World Bank. I mean, he has a lot of the Western bona fides we were looking for to find our person to deal with within Palestinian society. Now, it's not to say that Salam Fayyad is what is in power because of the US. However, it is to say that Salam Fayyad maintains his power because he has the support of the State Department and Clinton and Mitchell. It was Clinton, if you look back at the records, who made a huge to-do about the fact that they're only willing to give the Palestinian Society close to $900 million of our U.S. taxpayer dollars, in addition to what the G8 promised monies allocated to the Palestinians, only if the Prime Minister was Salam Fayyad. Because they knew if the money would get to Hamas, that would help continue funding terrorist activity. So Clinton even made a point about that it's going to go only Salam Fayyad. Now, Salam Fayyad is a very smart guy. Salam Fayyad is someone who understands the environment, and he's looking to create accountability, transparency, change the infrastructure within Palestinian society. Salam Fayyad was also the same individual who in 2006 ran against Hamas on a party that was called the Third Wave, or basically the wave of change, the party that was about reform for change, and he only won 3 seats. So we have to understand the political dynamic of why we and how we are playing a significant role within this larger dynamic. So if if you take everything I've said up until now and understand this larger political environment, what it really, translates is the fact that the classic, what is considered to be model of peace between Israelis and Palestinians under the auspices of what is called a two-state solution is no longer a viable model, because you really don't have two states. I would argue you have 3 states. Some would even argue you have 5 states, depending on where you go. But there is basically a 3-state dynamic that exists here, geographically speaking, within the parameters and within the confines of this area. You have Hamas within the Gaza Strip, you have Fatah in the West Bank, and you have Israel. And so the question is, how does all of this lead to something new, or to at least produce some kind of steps that are going to be what George Mitchell defined at the time in 2001, confidence-building measures that are going to lead to some kind of, at least the parties coming together, talking about what would be led to a peaceful environment. Hopefully, peace will come about when they agree on what that might look like. However, there has to be also an acknowledgement that this model has shifted. This model de facto does exist. Because if you go back to what I said earlier, the fact is U.S. foreign policy and Israeli foreign policy is one and the same. We don't negotiate with terrorist organizations. That means that nobody goes to negotiate with Gaza. Nobody goes into Hamas. Nobody talks to Khalid Mashal. Nobody talks to Muhammad Zahar. They all know that these individuals, they don't bring anything to the table because they don't recognize the parties involved. So we have de facto recognized clearly the West Bank. And the best illustration of that is that when Israel had to go into Operation Cast Lead in 2009, before Obama's inauguration, they went into Gaza with the sole goal of dismantling the terrorist infrastructure of what took place within the Gaza Strip. You polled Palestinians living in the West Bank. They were thrilled about the fact that Israel went in to take care of Hamas. To tell you that Hamas is a threat to Fatah's way of life, than as it is to Israelis. It was Keith Dayton's troops who trained the Palestinian police. I mean, for a while, it was Mahmoud Abbas who could not leave his own compound without Israeli security because he was fearful of what the implications might be if a Hamas assassination would take place on his life. So there is that dynamic that takes place. And what you see is, if you bring it forward to where we are today, you do not see Hamas around the table. What you do see is, you see individuals like Mahmoud Abbas and like Salam Fayyad who are coming to the table and discussing with Bibi under Clinton's auspices with this larger dynamic. And so that is I would say, the Israeli-Palestinian narrative revisited on the idea that, where we need to look at the two-state solution that is really no longer a two-state, but really, what are the factions within Palestinian society that will allow Israel to negotiate with somebody. And that somebody has thus far been proven to be only under Fatah within the West Bank. And that is a challenging shift. However, from a policy perspective, the model State Department still talks about today is still a two-state solution. There is a belief that Hamas will come into the fold and de facto of being the majority party of the Palestinian Legislative Council, they will change their tune. Believe me, they have no intention of changing their tune. They like what they represent, they like what they stand for, and it translates into monetary compensation from them. They are getting their support from Iran. They are funded by Ahmadinejad. Ahmadinejad was the second person to congratulate Hamas's election in 2006. And then in 2007, he basically told them, as long as you stay true to your Islamist radical agenda, we will continue to support you. And here's $50 million to support that. And the first group to congratulate them was the Muslim Brotherhood, which is what Hamas grew out of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the group that started in Egypt in 1928. And so these two groups are the ones that are continuing to support Hamas's agenda and Hamas's popularity. All of this, take this into consideration, and you look at the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic today. The number one issue for Netanyahu has been under this current government is that, you talk about, a place where it's also hard to come to a consensus of opinions. It is the state of Israel. Israelis have, we always joke around, a country of 7 million prime ministers. Everybody has an opinion. And to say, that come to a consensus is very difficult. However, the one thing Israelis do agree upon, left, right, or center, is the fact that Iran, in its current state, is an existential threat to the state of Israel today. And that being said, they have been willing to say or do whatever it takes to get support on the Iranian issue. The negotiations that have been taking place within Washington and between the Israeli delegations and the American delegations, the conversations between Benjamin Netanyahu and Barack Obama were about the fact that, we're talking, there was a question about moratorium of settlements, which in many people's minds is the crux of the problem of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And Netanyahu was able to say, you want to freeze on settlements? Fine, I will do that. 9 months of freezing of settlements took place under my administration. It is the first time that has taken place. Mind you, even under the peace, the Oslo Peace Accords in the 90s, construction continued to take place under left-wing governments in Israel. It was never the sticking point that was going to make or break the deal. But Netanyahu's point was that Iran is an existential threat to the state of Israel today, and we are not going to compromise on that. We want your support on this issue. That is, if you want us to free settlements, no problem, we'll free settlements, and that's what Netanyahu did. However, he wanted a quid pro quo, that is support on Iran. That has still been the equation. From the Israeli perspective, the challenge they have had within Washington circles is that basically from their perspective, and from the outlook on the situation is basically that Obama's team has put settlements and Iran on the same playing field as if they were a similar threat. And that has not been the case, and Netanyahu has proven that. If you go around the Arab streets today and you talk about Arab, polling and Arabic, public opinion, and this is exactly what George Mitchell and his team has been hearing all along. The perception is not a perception. The fact is that people could care less, and the Arab world has been pretty consistent about that, about whether or not there will be peace between Israelis and Palestinians, but what is the U.S. going to do when it comes to the Iranian nuclear threat? The threat of a nuclear Iran to the Muslim world is more threatening than anything else. And that is something that we need to take into consideration. We're looking about, peace in the Middle East. There is a belief, and the fact is that Sunnis and Shiites, which is the largest cleavage between within the Muslim world, that if Iran becomes the dominant force in the region, Sunnis will have to come and pay homage to the Iranians. And when Ahmadinejad is talking about a historical frame of mind, he's talking about Persia. He's talking about the fact that when Iran, under the Persian Empire, was the dominating force in the region, that's what he wants to bring back when he is talking about, theologically, when he's talking about creating this whole nuclear arms race. That's, in his mind, what he is doing. To the credit of the Arab-Israeli conflict at large, historically, the conflict has always remained conventional. I mean conventional from a military perspective. There has never been an introduction of WMDs into the conflict at large. And even in 1973, when there was talk about the fact, after the Yom Kippur War, that Israel might introduce or not introduce nuclear arms, that was never the case. And Israel's policy has always been that they are never going to be the first country to introduce nuclear arms into the conflict. That has always been that, ask any, I do not represent the Israeli government, but mind you, that is the Israeli line. Whatever you ask them, they are not going to be the first. It is always considered to be the last line of defense. Of what Israel may or may not do, but they have never ever introduced nuclear arms into the conflict to their credit, and that's a positive thing. Ahmadinejad has no problem with that. He will introduce, he has introduced it, and what you're seeing on the Arab street is the fact that what you're seeing, construction of a nuclear plant on the Nile. What you're seeing is the same thing in Saudi Arabia. So if you want to maintain a conventional warfare within the Middle East at large, one should pay attention to what the Arab world is saying about how they feel about Ahmadinejad's proclamations. They are taking it at face value. And the challenge really is how do we maintain peace in the region when you're talking about the fact that the most of the Arab world is predominantly concerned about Iran and less so about the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic. What is unique even more than this larger issue is the fact that because there is a belief within the Muslim world that because of what's happening in Iraq and because of our involvement in different parts of the Middle East, that the U.S. is not going to engage in military action in the Middle East. As a result of that, what you are seeing is you're seeing a creation of what is considered to be called a Sunni crescent. You are seeing the Sunni countries coming together with the state of Israel to talk about what they may or may not do when the time comes to deal with Iran. If anybody here has read the latest article in The Atlantic by Jeffrey Goldberg, there was a huge to-do about when we're at the 11th hour and what the implications might be when Iran becomes fully nuclear. From the Israeli narrative and from the Israeli intelligence reports, as well as from American intelligence reports. I mean, if you look at Gates' latest statement, even Gates in his last testimony in Congress was talking about a matter of months, not a matter of years. It's about, the Israel and the United States don't agree on the exact, when exactly is D-Day coming as far as the exact time, but they're not off. It's about a matter of months of how much they are off on the intelligence that we have when Ahmadinejad is going to become fully nuclear capable with that regard. And the question really is, what are the implications of that? The general implications, obviously, is, of course, you want to start a nuclear arms race in the region, and you're going to see, you want to make sure how to maintain that, and that's really that is really what Netanyahu is trying to stress to Obama. The fact that you cannot you're not going to be able to contain Ahmadinejad with economic sanctions. They are great, but there has to be a question of how far they will take you. It's interesting that actually the policy that we have embraced is what is considered to be terror-free divestment that has come out of different states here, on the state and the federal level, as far as trying to put pressure on Iran by not investing in Iranian companies. There is no direct investment from the U.S. into Iranian companies, only through third parties, and we've tried that tactic. That has been a policy actually introduced by Benjamin Netanyahu. And we have adopted that policy. So it's not to say that Israel is not, opposed or against economic sanctions. What they are concerned about is there also a military option on the table? Because that's what they are considering. And they know, and everybody knows, that you cannot do this, they will not do this on their own. I mean, if you look historically at the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic, and namely, it was Israel in 1981 that took out the Osirak reactor in Iraq. It was a very different, scenario. It's a very, very the nuclear reactor in Osirak was above ground. You could calculate the radius of the casualties, and it took a lot to actually produce that military campaign. The Reagan administration at the time was furious that Israel had actually the audacity to go into Iraq and make this happen. However, in retrospect, had the Israelis not bombed the reactor in 81, 91 would have been a disaster. And everybody acknowledges that later on in retrospect of what Israel was able to do to prevent what at the time Saddam Hussein was manufacturing. Iran is a lot more complicated. Nazal, Bashir, the reactors are all underground. It's a matter of locating the exact location and actually hitting the centrifuge. If you have not done that, you haven't done anything. You have to pinpoint the exact, and it's a very complicated military operation to orchestrate, to say the least. But the idea of the Sunni crescents going along is basically that the option would be, if there is not U.S. support on this, that Israel would use Saudi airspace to go into Iran. And that's a possibility that they are entertaining. And that's really something to keep in mind when we're looking at this larger dynamic. But if you take all of this and bring it back to the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic, I think it's important to say that, to look at the fact that, how all this is weighing out. There's been a lot more pressure and a lot more visibility on the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic as it relates to trying to establish peace, whereas the Arab world at large is mostly concerned about, is the U.S. going to act when it comes to Iran? And this to tell you that Iran is more on people's mind than is the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic. It's not to say that it's not important, the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, but it is to say that in comparison to Iran, the Israeli-Palestinian peace process pales in the eyes of the Arab world. And that is not a new sentiment. I mean, from the Arab world's perspective, the Palestinians have always been the underdog of the Arab world. It's not a new thing. But the threat of Iran to them today means that they're even willing to concede working with the Jewish state when it comes to the Iranian threat. And I think that that is a very telling statement in the eyes of the Arab world. Let me add one more thing, and I'll open up to as many questions as you might have. I threw a lot out here, and I'm sure people have questions. I think that, I don't want to sound pessimistic. I'm not, I would love to see peace in the region. I've been involved in different capacities in the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations here in the United States, as well as on the Israeli side when I was serving in the IDF. But I think that the more time, the more time goes by, the more things stay the same when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian and the Arab-Israeli conflict at large. I mean, if you look historically speaking, there are three issues that have always been the core of the negotiations when it comes to trying to negotiate and broker a peace process between Israelis and Palestinians. And one has been Jerusalem, the other has been 67 borders, that is the aspect of the settlements, and the third one has been the Palestinian right of return, that is Palestinian refugees, and will they be allowed or not be allowed to come back. No Israeli government, left, right, or center, will ever accept a full right of return. It will alter the integrity of the Jewish state and the majority of the Jewish state, and that is not going to happen. What is happened over the years has been a debate about monetary compensation. There's been an amount about percentage of the original 1948-1949 refugees. But what Benjamin Netanyahu has added to the mix, which is unique to Netanyahu, is the aspect of recognition. The model for peace in the Middle East that is looked upon by many policymakers in Washington, and I would argue for sure with President Obama, is the model of the Camp David negotiations of 1979. That was brokered, that was Carter's involvement. That is establishing peace between Israel and Egypt. And that model was based on a formula that was put forth in a resolution of the United Nations in 1967 after the aftermath of the Six-Day War. That is something called UN Resolution 242. And the model was based on the concept of land for peace. The idea that if one gives back land, one will achieve peace. Mind you, in the French version or in the Russian version and in the English version, there is no mention of the word recognition. It alludes to the fact that if you give back land, you will achieve peace. But there is no mention of the word recognition. What Benjamin Netanyahu has done with this larger aspect of trying to retweak or kind of rework the whole dynamic is add the aspect of recognition. What he is asking for is very simple. He is saying, in the same way that Palestinians see a theological bond and a connection between them and the land itself, he, Netanyahu, wants that for Jews, to say, we also have a right to the land itself in the same way you see yourself. And that is a very sophisticated way of putting it. because if you understand the narrative of the Arab world from the inception of when the State of Israel was created, the modern State of Israel in 1948, the belief was that Israel was seen as a temporary military fact that they will be able to overcome at some point. And to say that from now on, we are now changing the narrative and saying we are now recognizing Israel's right to exist and it's no longer a temporary military fact is basically putting a mirror in the eyes of the Arab world, because that will cause them to change how they foresee at large the existence of the State of Israel. And that has, that's the implication. And that's why Netanyahu is having many stumbling blocks, to say the least, when he is negotiating this aspect, because he is saying, I'm going to put, a lot on the table, almost everything that, that is being, asked of him. However, he is demanding recognition, and that recognition is not that simple, because this is what it means for the Arab world. It means it will force them to say, Israel has a right to exist, and namely Palestinians will have to say, Israel has a right to exist in the same way we do. And from an educational perspective, that will also force them to change, which they have not changed, unfortunately, over the past 17 years, how they educate their youth. Palestinian youth today are still led to believe that Israel has no right to exist. You look at Palestinian textbooks, you will see no map of the State of Israel. And that's the challenge. I'm a firm believer in education. I believe that things can happen, but the reform has to take place by these small, going back to George Mitchell, confidence building measures. And if peace is going to happen in the Middle East, the incitement has to stop on all fronts. So on that pessimistic note, let me end and let me open up to as many questions as you might have. Thank you for your time.
Asaf, I have two questions for you. One, do you have a diagnosis of what I agree with you was a terrible mistake by the Obama administration to elevate the status of the settlements? I mean, Obama went to town on the issue of the settlements, and then the Palestinians obviously couldn't walk away from that.
Right.
So why, I think this was a terrible blunder by Obama.
Right.
What led to that? Number one. And my second question is, what about the Turks in all of this? That's, I think, a big piece of the current puzzle.
Sure. Let me, I'll start with your settlement question. Everybody loves to talk about the settlements, and I think, that they are an important aspect to talk about.
Well, and it is, it's a very troubling policy,
yeah, it is.
Right? I'm speaking from the left. I oppose.
No, I understand where you're coming from. And I think that the question has been, what Netanyahu is proving with the moratorium, that it's not about land, but it's about ideology. And this is, more to the fact that, it is really, you're right about the fact that it's really Obama introduced the aspect that a prerequisite to negotiations has to be a freezing of settlements. That was never a prerequisite before. And I think that it's not to say that Israel is not willing to negotiate or leverage land for peace. They're willing to do that. I think that the biggest challenge is, again, going back to 242, is what land? The actual legality of this whole, how it plays out, that the Arab world sees 67 as fait accompli. That, we talk about land for peace, we're talking about exactly land for peace and exactly 67. And this is where the French version and the English version, don't agree. There is no, the French version says the, when referring to, thus, and the English version doesn't say that. And so you have this kind of premise for saying, well, only compromise can only take place when you have a full exchange of this land for peace.
But what about what left-wing commentators, what the whole left in Israel is saying, that, Netanyahu showed that he could freeze settlements, but he won't boot Lieberman and his ilk out of the cabinet, and Netanyahu's political survival apparently is predicated on supporting this settlement insanity, which costs billions and costs lives.
Agreed, but I also don't think...
you portray Netanyahu as
Yeah, but you can even,
even
see that even Netanyahu in his own party, when you have factions like Lieberman, is a lot more to the center than an individual like, than Lieberman. And what's interesting about, the model of the old, Zionist left in Israel, I'm sure you remember, the old model for peace in the Middle East in the 80s, and even before that was the idea of the two-state solution.
Mm-hmm.
We all walked around with, the idea of, the women in black. There was idea of, coming together, Americans for Peace Now. There was all these movements going around about creating a two-state solution, and that was predicated on recognizing the PLO as the negotiating party we're going to deal with. Now, if you poll Palestinian society today, what is interesting, even more telling about this, that even, young Palestinians have moved away from that model. They are now talking about a one-state solution, which is a departure from the classic two-state solution, which I think is also quite telling, even for the Israeli Zionist left, whereas it's no longer about two states living side by side. It's about the fact that there is an attempt to say, well, if the birth rate of Palestinians is greater than the birth rate of Israelis, and if majority rules, we will be able to overtake the state of Israel. And so that is from the Israeli narrative, left, right, or center is, how do you maintain what is considered to be peace and security with a Jewish majority? And that's their narrative, even if you consider the fact that, they're willing, and even with the latest tweak, even under Olmert, was about, are they willing to look at, H1 and H2, E1 and E2 vis-a-vis suburbs of Jerusalem. And they've come to all these conclusions vis-a-vis the maps. But I think that even more telling than that is, and their biggest problem is, again, how are they able to minimize Hamas's influence? And how are they able to also influence the environment that is affected by Iran as it's affecting the region at large? And I think that.
But Netanyahu would get so much love from Washington if he would ditch Lieberman and bring Kadima into the coalition.
He might.
Lieberman is a crook for one thing, as
Yeah.
well as a total shrieking ideologue.
Well, I mean, listen, corruption in Israeli politics is no different
no
different than American politics. I mean, I think that it's I think that it is, I think that,
he says all kinds of embarrassing things.
Sure he
You
does.
have Yishai and all these.
You have a lot of these guys saying embarrassing things. I mean,
But what good are they doing? Why isn't that
Listen, it's Israeli politics. Here it's no joke. Israel has 7 million prime ministers. And the fact that, they have to elevate the threshold, the fact that you can have, in '84 they had close to 25 parties. Nobody has that. I mean, everybody who feels that they are dissed in some way or another starts a new party. And so you have this coalition system that Israel has, that it's ridiculous that one has to deal with in order to create some kind of consensus issue. There is no doubt that, Lieberman, makes these comments, and you make these, ridiculous statements that are not helping Israeli PR, or not helping the Israeli narrative. But here, you have one of the most eloquent speakers and one of the best trained historians who is now serving, when it comes to the Middle East, as Israel's ambassador, Michael Oren.
Mm-hmm.
I've known Michael for over 25 years. And Michael is the best, he's actually done, his study was on the 6-Day War, one of the, his book on the topic. Oren was confronted by the same issue when he went to, I don't know if you've seen what happened at UC Irvine to Michael Oren. And Oren was booed because of exactly all the issues that Israel, human rights abuses and all these aspects, it wasn't even about the settlements. And so, to cling on to the notion that settlements are basically holding all the problems in the Middle East, I think that, that's a bit, it's not looking at the larger picture. I think that if it came down to a valuable peace, to say, we're giving back land, there's going to be two states living side by side, even Netanyahu would concede to make that happen. And I think that, Netanyahu, it was Netanyahu in 1996, if you look at his own history, that was willing to give back. I mean, he followed suit by his predecessor. It's not something he wouldn't do. But I do think that part of the larger aspect that we have to consider is the radical Islamist ideology that is being put out there that has no recognition. I mean, Israelis are, they're willing to concede settlements. They're willing to say, listen, if you're willing to move on the issue of Iran, we'll put a moratorium on settlement. No Israeli politician has done that. And the fact that Netanyahu is willing to do it, I think is quite telling, despite the fact that he has individuals like Lieberman and like other people who are on the far right. And so that I give Netanyahu credit for. I mean, I think that he's learned from his mistakes when he was first prime minister, and he's moved on to kind of figure out what it's going to require. But the Middle East has also shifted. I mean, you know, at the time, it was Arafat who held all the cards. We all thought that, you know, we put all our money in Yasser Arafat and said, okay, Arafat's going to deliver, and if Arafat signs the agreement, it's going to move forward. Arafat's no longer part of the picture. What's missing from his dynamic is the gravitas that Arafat had on the Palestinian street. I mean, when Abbas and Fayyad go around, you know, in the streets of Gaza, they have no respect whatsoever. There's no way that's, you know, ever going to, you know, they're never going to get whatever, you know, that kind of street credibility. But the question is, you know, where they're going to get their support, and where is the money going to come from to create this Palestinian state to be? That's going to come from U.S. taxpayer dollars. But this on the Turkish issue, and I want to address that as well. The Turks have shifted. I mean, listen, this last flotilla incident took place, you know, where, you know, the IHH, which was a terrorist cell by you know, that, you know, affiliated with Al Qaeda, that maneuvered this flotilla thing, was a phenomenal PR image for the Palestinians. And it's exactly, you know, if you saw the rallies in the streets of Gaza after the flotilla, seeing again the image of the aggressor of Israel going in and dealing with this, even though that Israel, you know, was very clear that, you know, 5 out of the 6 docked at the port of Ashdod. They wanted to deliver goods into Gaza. They were more than free and more than welcome to do so. However, the intention of these individuals was to create damage, casualties, and whatnot. And I think what's telling about the Turkish change is, of course, the shift that, you know, the Kurdish areas, where have been the location of a lot of these terrorist influences are coming in, how they are affecting individuals like Erdogan. The fact that Erdogan is now putting at stake, instead of an ally like Israel, who's been an ally for many years in the U.S., but was putting now more stake in individuals like, not individuals, but countries like Syria and like Iran, and supporting these initiatives. I think that's quite telling about, you know, Turkey, who for years was seen as the par excellence example of what a Muslim secular country should look like. And I think that's changing as a result of his own leadership. I mean, you can't really make the argument anymore that Erdogan is a moderate. And I think that Israel acknowledges that. I mean, so we have this problem. I mean, that's a given. Yeah.
You mentioned George Mitchell, and then you mentioned Clinton, and Americans giving money for our foreign policy. My question to you is, what role do the Palestinian people living in the United States play, if any, in the formation of American foreign policy towards this issue?
They play a lot. I mean, the 2 largest communities in what's considered to be the Palestinian diaspora in the United States post 1949, after Israel's War of Independence, are Dearborn, Michigan, and Jacksonville, Florida. What you see is that, you know, you have many groups on the Hill today who, you know, involved with the Arab American, you know, the ADC is involved. There's a lot of Palestinian groups that are involved in lobbying on the Hill, talking about this. There was a group called the Jerusalem Conference. There were a few groups that came together of Palestinian academics and others to say, listen, you know, we need to create what's going to be the vision of the Palestinian state to be, and even more so now under Fayyad, who understands the value of lobbying in the United States to make these concessions happen and to make that work out. So from that perspective, that also plays a huge role. I mean, you have a lot of lobbying going on the Hill, talking about, you know, we need to create a Palestinian state. There is no doubt that Obama came into office with the assumption that he would be able to create, you know, or, you know, forgot, not the assumption, but, you know, that he wanted to make the Israeli-Palestinian, you know, in peace process definitely a priority. I think that, you know, peace in the Middle East is not that simple, as I'm sure everybody here in the room understands. And I think that, you know, I think Obama is also learning that you just can't go in and parachute a plan and say, I have the goods and I'll just give you the money and create a Palestinian state. Even Salam Fayyad, is very slick about it. He's basically arguing the point that, well, all of the years that Arafat was going around supporting the revolution, we didn't create infrastructure. So I need to create infrastructure. And it might take me 15, 20 years. So the onus is not put on the Palestinians, but it's put on, the dynamic is shifting, okay, well, despite the fact we still have to create, a peace process. And so, and Israel is willing to be part of that. I know that the threat of a nuclear Iran for the Israelis is more problematic to them than anything else. And from the asymmetrical warfare that they're fighting in the north and the south, there is the intelligence speaks for itself. Hezbollah is funded by Iran, Hamas is funded by Iran. And so those are the two borders that are basically bookending the state of Israel, from Lebanon and where Hezbollah is operating to Gaza, where Hamas is operating. So they know that they have to deal with that environment. The larger aspect, if you're talking, is how do you well, if we need to fight them, we also have to fight the Iranians, and the Iranians are allowing all of this to happen. And so that is that's where it plays out from their kind of national security interest. But the point is that there's a lot. To go back to your specific question, there is a lot of lobbying going on to generate that, because there is a belief. I don't agree with that belief, but there is a belief that that there is a clear linkage between solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the region at large. I would argue the opposite. I do not believe that, if you put all issues aside, if you just, if there was no Israel, just for argument's sake, there would still be Sunni Shia cleavages, there would still be a rise of radical Islam, and I think it's easier sometimes to focus on the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic because it's something that is more tangible. There's a lot more flexibility. The Israelis would compromise, and they know that, and they operate as a democratic state that they are. The Arab states are not necessarily democratic states. They're not rational states. They're not dealing with the same environment that you're going to put pressure. You can't say, giving carrots, and saying, here, I'm going to solve the problem. They're going to say, that's nice, but I don't really care about that. And so one has to keep that in mind when you're talking, and we saw that also with Iraq. I mean, I had many colleagues, who were involved, in Bremer's team, who went in to talk about the fact, what is democracy in Iraq going to look like? Iraq is a unique situation because, pre the Ba'ath Party, Iraq had democratic elements. So they were able to say, okay, based on what happened in the 50s, we can bring it back to that model where there was Christian and Jewish representation in the Iraqi parliament, and can Sharia law work with democracy? But that's always a big question, about these issues. But lobbying helps. Lobbying helps, and Washington, is a place to be to lobby on these issues, as everybody here is aware of. And the Palestinians make a case. And it's easier to, to Julie's comment, to say, oh, the Israelis are building, in the settlement, and that's, an obstruction to peace, and all of this has taken place. And so, yeah, there is a challenge. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But I can tell you, historically speaking, construction in these areas has never been an obstacle for peace. It's happened under Oslo for 7 years. I mean, it continued to happen. But it's, to hang your hat on this and say, it's only about the settlements is wrong. Yeah.
Given the Arab concern about Iran, what was the Arab reaction to Obama's response during the attempted revolution, the Green Party revolution in Iran?
I think that, well, first of all, what you saw in Iran is very interesting. They obviously tried to minimize, the coverage coming out of Iran because, the Green Movement was something that, we support that. It's something, great that's happening. It's actually, if you poll Iranian society, there's more Western sentiment in Iran than there is, for example, in countries like Iraq or Syria. But the fact is that, he's supported by the mullahs. So he has that, he has that playing out for Ahmadinejad and his force in play as far as popularity on the street and on his street. However, you look at the Arab world again. This is where the Sunni Shia dynamic takes place. Iran being a Shia country, they will tell you because they are Shiites and Ahmadinejad is basically implementing a Shiite doctrine. This is what happens when you fall under, a Shiite dominant, individual like Ahmadinejad. However, you did see, people going out and trying to reach out and talking. And interestingly enough, there is still a Jewish community in Iran. And there were a lot of these radio broadcasts who were reporting what was happening in Iran at the time of the, when all this was happening, when the protests and whatnot, and trying to get the word out, to try to get public opinion and whatnot. I think there was a lot of disappointment from the Arab world and from the Iranians themselves that we were silent. If you remember, it took us a long time to make any statement, and the fact that we saw some kind of shift in Iran. That we should say something about that. But I think that we have been burned on the Iranian issue for a long time. And if you go back to 1979, what happened when Khomeini's rise to power and the removal of the Shah, and of course the hijacking of the embassy and everything that we under what happened under Carter's administration, they very careful about what to say about the Iranians. And then again, you have an individual like Ahmadinejad who still comes to New York, was just here, leaves and is able to say what he, 9/11 is a conspiracy, all these things that we know are false. However, on the Arab street, they sell. And he goes around and was able to sell this as if it were true facts. And I think that he's playing that. And I think that the other part is, of course, that, it's just another sign to them that they need to take care of themselves in the fashion they're used to, and that's a danger, because I think that we're better off trying to help the situation in ways that are productive versus letting everything happen. I think the biggest fear today that we, as I mentioned, is really making sure that the Middle East stays conventional. We do not want to go in engaging in a nuclear arms race in the region today. That is, I'm sure everybody in the room understands what the implications of that are. Forget militarily, but also economically, we talk about, what this might mean. The fact that the Russian and the Chinese are still purchasing, oil and gas from the Iranians, they're basically saying, well, America is, no longer really a factor here. Is there really that much of a global concern? And to say, okay, if Iran becomes nuclear, so what? That so what could come back and bite us. We don't want to be in that situation because he means what he says. This is not, you watch, I've watched and observed for years and studied these individuals. It was quite telling that people like Saddam Hussein, Yasser Arafat, they were very much like, they were chameleons, drama queens for all intents and purposes. You would have, one statement in Arabic and then a whole other statement in English saying, no, we didn't mean what we said. These individuals are, Hassan Nasrallah, Ahmadinejad, Khalid Mashal, they are not lying about what they are saying. They really believe it. And the fact is that we're the ones saying they don't mean what they say. And I think that's the lost in translation we're facing. It's the opposite these days. Ahmadinejad literally believes, according to Shiite tenets, that a nuclear Iran will bring back the last Imam, the 12th Imam, the Mahdi. And that will solidify Shiism in the world, in the Islamic world. And he truly believes that. Whether or not, the mullahs think he's serious or not, he sees it as a mechanism and as a conduit to lead to this. And that, we should consider that. Because he relies on that theological kind of political understanding of the world. In our minds, it may be crazy. But he's quite rational in his thinking. If anybody who's followed the interviews, I know he does this on TV. He's very slick, and he makes a clear presentation. And and many his supporters, especially in UN circles, they believe it. So whether we walk out of the General Assembly or not, that's a nice statement. But there has to be a little bit also action to that. Other questions? Solving the Arab-Israeli conflict. I can do that, in 60 minutes. Well, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.